Knight and Changeling, Chapter 21. Who Wins? They raced into the temple. It seemed that over the years the esoterica had been waiting for the Dagon's return. The walls were lined with suits they wore. How they had found the temple was anyone's guess, and didn't really matter right now. Right now, what mattered was that they seemed to have used their powers to bend physics to arrive before them. The tank containing Vilgax was already here, and between them and the sword that stood in the Dagon's heart on a dais in the center of the room. The mysterious woman in green moved first, leaping over the first wave of esoterica and throwing a wave of fire from her bare hands. The esoterica scattered, vanishing into thin air as the creatures in the tank roared and bashed tentacles into the glass, shattering it.
"I will not be kept from my power! Kill them all!"
He roared and the battle began. Swords clashed with yellow electricity the esoterica wielded. Conduit Edwards took it upon himself to engage the woman, who'd already proved more powerful than the others. Only George remained free of the combat as the squid-like creature yanked itself across the floor towards the heart. But he should not have underestimated this weak-looking being as it snagged him around the ankle and threw him hard into the wall. "George!" The woman turned, and Conduit took his chance. Drawing on the powers granted him as one of the esoterica, he summoned a blade of pure energy and drove it forward. It was supposed to slam into the woman's heart, but it didn't sink into skin like it should have. Instead, with a sound like a shoe being pulled from a deep puddle of mud, the blade sank in without seeming to do any damage whatsoever. Instead of blood, purple mud rimmed the edge of the wound. The would-be wound. She turned. Well, not quite. Her whole head rotated as did her arms, and Conduit went flying as she smacked him back, taking advantage of his shock. She managed to sort herself out as George began to pull himself to his feet.
"Get the sword!"
He called out, and she leapt forward, but too late. Vilgax wrapped a tentacle around the hilt, and red lightning flew from his eyes as bright lights filled the temple. When the light dimmed enough for them to see, he was standing tall, covered in armor, holding the sword. Conduit pulled himself to his feet and blinked, horror crossing his face.
"Imposter!"
He leapt at Vilgax, screaming a challenge as the woman leapt towards him too. He reached out a hand, and the blast of power sprang forth, leaving Conduit crumpled at the base of a column. At the woman, he swung the sword in an arc. A whirlwind sprang from nowhere, sending her flying into a wall, with what should have been a crunch. But instead, a splat sounded as the woman hit, dissolving into purple mud that shuddered before pulling itself into something vaguely human-shaped and trying to stand. But green lights flashed, and a soft groan rang from the unconscious form of Jennifer Tennyson. Vilgax cackled.
"I have never felt so powerful. I could kill you without ever touching you, Tennyson."
He leveled the sword at her, but he paused as a voice rumbled around him.
"There is much more power to be had. Break the seal, and you will have all the power you wish. You'll even be able to take the power from her that you crave. Your every wish will be granted."
Vilgax looked over the heart and smiled wickedly.
"Deal."
Gwen was trying to focus, but something kept cutting in. She was terrified it might be the Dagon, but no. This was familiar. Warm, not the cool, minty green of the Dagon, but the warm, toxic green of a very familiar altered mana signature. She blinked. Jen was reaching out across the mana field. Images flooded her mind, and Jen and an old man racing along the tunnel towards the seal. "Vilgax has the heart." The words echoed loudly in her mind, the volume a sign of urgency and lack of control more than anything else. "Kevin, pull over!" The wheels on the car squealed as he yanked the car over to the side of the road.
"What's wrong?"
Gwen took his hand. "We're going the wrong way. Jen, she's with the knights. Vilgax already has the heart. They're heading for the seal." Kevin swore.
We're hours from the seal.
Not if I teleport us.
Kevin shook his head. You can't. You can barely pull that trick off when you're at full power. But you're still sick after what happened at the warehouse.
Gwen nodded. If we had a choice, I wouldn't do this. She took his hands and focused. They vanished from the car and reappeared in the cavern. Gwen cried out in rage as she spotted Jen on the ground next to the old man, George. She was bleeding from a slash on her cheek, and a bruise was already forming on her face. George was trying to pull himself up, but Vilgax was beating on the seal with Ascalon. Kevin snatched up a helmet and absorbed the metal, throwing himself at Vilgax to try and stop him breaking the seal. He was tossed aside like a piece of trash. Vilgax laughed in triumph as light bloomed. Then he screamed as it grew brighter. Jen started awake to the sound of a sword clattering to the rocks. Pink lights faded from around her as she shot to her feet, rubbing her aching head. Summoning Artemis's powers, she healed herself as George made his way to the seal. "Where's Vilgax?" she asked the cavern in general, hoping someone would have an explanation.
Through the crack. That means we won, right?
Kevin said, pulling himself up and helping Gwen to her feet as Jen swore loudly. "No. That means the Dagon has his heart back," she said angrily. George stepped to the seal and picked up Ascalon. Lights bloomed again. This time, though, they were warmer, and when they died down, George stood before them, young again, mid-20s at the oldest, and covered in armor.
"Let him come. We will be ready."
Chapter 22. In the Stars. If someone was asked to describe Rook Blanco, the first word to come to mind was almost always patience. He had spent the past few years at the Plumber Academy, rising quickly through the ranks and excelling in his studies. But then the Vriedel brothers had snapped after a failed test and decided to blow up the entire academy. Luckily, by some miracle, no one had been harmed, but the academy itself had been destroyed, forcing the current graduating cadets to finish their courses in a plumber way station. Scout didn't seem too bothered by this. He was still deciding where he wanted to be stationed. He frowned over a star chart on his datapad. "I think I've figured it out," the Loboan exclaimed, a smile on his face. Rook looked up from his own paperwork.
"What have you figured out?"
he asked, raising an eyebrow.
"I'm going back to Anortransel."
Rook blinked at that.
"Why? It took a great deal of effort to get off Anortransel. Why go back?"
Rook scratched behind his ear and shrugged. "Because they need me. There's not a whole lot of law in the Anor system since the Vladats went extinct. And they weren't the best law to begin with. I can help my people, just like Gen 10 did. Earth's going to an open system next month. There's already a colony under her town. Maybe I can at least start something similar for the Anor system." Rook smiled at his roommate.
"That is an honorable mission, my friend."
Scout grinned, his tail wagging behind him.
"What about you? Where will you go?"
Rook took a deep breath. The good thing about being a rookie plumber was that, within reason, they picked their first station. It wasn't always the one they got, but the plumbers did their best to honor those requests.
"I will return to Ravana."
It was Scout's turn to frown. "Thought they didn't approve of your career choice?" he asked lightly. Rook nodded. "My father wishes me to stay on Ravana and farm the fields as my family has done for generations. My people are very traditional. He will expect me home for my 17th birthday." Scout shook his head. "You're not giving up being a plumber, are you? You love this job." Rook smiled. "Fear not, my friend. I do not know if I intend to stay on Ravana, but there is a tradition I wish to participate in, that Ravanaganders of 17 years may do." Scout raised an eyebrow. "Is this something I can know about, or is it like a closely guarded secret?" Rook shook his head. You are one of my closest friends. I have no secrets from you. It is a traditional trial that those who come of age at 17, once they have lost their Bienthak and learned the ways of the adult Ravanaгаnder, may choose to take. Some choose not to. Scout frowned. I thought you guys were all about tradition. Why would someone choose not to participate? Rook set down his datapad. Because it is a tradition that can change someone forever. On my world, we have a concept called Amar. It does not translate well, but as there is more to it than there's more to the word than a single word can encompass, but I suppose the easiest way to describe it is mated souls, created to balance each other. Two souls meant to find each other for the harmony of both. Scout nodded. We have something similar. We call them mates. Rook grinned and nodded. Exactly. The trial is meant to assist one in finding their Amar. Many choose not to participate because they believe they have already found their Amar. They do not wish to be proven wrong, as many have been. Scout nodded. So you don't think the girl you left behind is the one? Rook frowned at his friend's question. Your Amar, I mean. Rook shook his head. Rayona is lovely, and it is a match our parents approve. But I cannot help but feel that my destiny lies somewhere beyond Ravana. Scout nodded as Rook picked up the datapad again. So what happens during this trial? Rook shook his head. That I do not know. Only what happens after. If the signs point to Rayona being my Amar, I will propose when I return from the mountain where the trial takes place. If they do not, then I must apologize to her and take steps to find my Amar, my harmony, for my own peace of mind, if nothing else. Some who take the trial never find them, but I have hope. Scout grinned. I hope you find them. Your harmony. Sounds like a really good thing to have. But what if she's not on Ravana? The universe is a big place, Rook. He nodded. I know. I will pursue my career as a plumber and search as I go. I can only hope my Amar appears to me someday. What was the saying we learned in Earth Studies? Ah, yes. All good things to those who wait. Scout laughed at his friend as they finished up their paperwork. Within the week, Rook was back on Ravana. His family was overjoyed to see him, though his father kept sending disapproving looks at the things he'd brought with him and scoffed when he learned that Rook would not be returning home fully since he would be living at the small plumber base. The celebration of his 17th birthday was lovely, and as the night began to fall, he bowed to his parents. I have chosen to take the mountain's trial to guide me to my Amar. His father raised his eyebrows, but looked pleased that his son would not be abandoning tradition altogether. He nodded. Go forth, my son. The trial awaits you. It was the traditional farewell for this trial. His mother took down a bow and quiver from their place on the wall, along with a spear. May the stars guide you to harmony, she said, handing him the weapons. They were more of a traditional gesture than for true protection. The Muroids went after the fields, not the people of Ravana. Though some who went on this journey stayed gone for days, attempting to reconcile the signs they were given. He knew what he had to do next, as he nodded to his siblings. They nodded back. Rookshar had one hand on young one's shoulder, holding him back from either following Blanco or asking the million questions on his tongue. He hadn't lost his Bienthak yet, and as such had no knowledge of this tradition. Rook headed to the temple of Ravana Kai, where he was met by Master Kundo, who narrowed his eyes at him, but, ever bound by tradition, nodded and silently led him to the path at the base of the sacred mountain, several miles outside of town. May harmony find you. He managed to almost not sound bitter as he stepped aside so Rook could enter the pathway. The forest here was dense, but Rook had training for many a different kind of terrain thanks to the plumbers, and reached the top of the mountain without difficulty. A small cave entrance sat there, steam billowing out of it. Rook set down his weapons. No weapon was to ever enter this sacred place. He also took off his shoes. He'd always been told that was part of the trial as well. He was glad for the first time since removing it to be without his plumber-issued armor. It was warm in the cave, and his armor would have put him at a disadvantage. The loose robes that were traditional for his people were much cooler. It was also dark, and he almost wished for his flashlight back at Plumber Base. But he shook his head and headed down the tunnel. It was going down quite steeply. This was where all the stories he'd been told left off. No one spoke of what was in this sacred place, just the steaming entrance. He knew by the description that he had the right place as he began to sweat. He could not imagine what waited for him at the end. Eventually, he emerged in a cave that had to take up most of the mountain. It was so large he couldn't see the top. His excellent night vision did nearly nothing to help him in the near blackness of the cave. It was only when his bare feet met a pool of liquid that he paused. The liquid rippled and shimmered like silver despite the lack of light. Steam plumed in greater mass, and Rook tensed slightly as a voice echoed around the cavern. "You have come to seek knowledge." It wasn't a question, but the voice was not threatening, though he could not find out the source of it. It was wispy and ethereal, as if not of this world. "Step into the water, Rook Blanco. See what you wish to see." He did not feel any fear as he stepped into the water, which was still shimmering silver. On instinct, he laid back in the water once he was out far enough. He couldn't tell how deep the water went, but still he felt no fear as he stared up into the steam. After a moment, he blinked. The steam was forming into shapes that raced around and vanished before he could make any sense of them. The voice echoed around him again. "You search for your harmony, but you will not find it here. Your harmony is a very long way away." Stars spun in the steam, but vanished too quickly for him to identify patterns. "A warrior of great merit. She defends the stars, as you will, too. A lonely one among thousands. Your balance is among the stars, Rook Blanco. Find her. You will need each other." The voice faded, the images in the steam disappearing, leaving Rook blinking at the edge of the pool of water. More questions than answers flooded his mind as he pulled himself out of the water and shook off the sparkling drops. But he had one answer. His destiny, his harmony, did not rest here on Ravana. He made his way slowly out of the cave and took his time pulling his shoes on. He picked up the weapons carefully. He took his time heading back down the mountain. It was nearing dawn as he made it back to town, still damp from the pool. His family was still awake, all but young one, who slept with his head in Rookshar's lap. Rayona was there too, and he felt his heart twist slightly. He liked her, but it wasn't love. And if she was not his, then she had her own harmony to find, and he would not keep her from that. He knelt before her, laying the weapons down. She closed her eyes, disappointment written on her face. This was not how Ravanaganders proposed. Quite the opposite. He bowed his head. "I must offer my humblest apologies. I am not your harmony, and will not keep you from finding them. As I hope, you will not keep me back from mine." Rayona swallowed her tears and nodded, taking his hand and pulling him to his feet. "I will not keep you from harmony. May it find you someday soon. May harmony find you as well." She dropped his hands and turned away, walking with grace back to her family home. The trial was over. He could tell no one exactly what he had seen, but if he chose to, he could share hints at the signs he'd seen. But finding his Amar was up to him. His father looked almost resigned, but Rook-Shar had the curious light in her eyes that he often saw in the mirror. It was no surprise when she knocked on his door later that day.
Shar?
Blanco? I know you cannot tell me exactly what happened, but will you tell me something? Rook Blanco nodded.
Within the next few months, I will be transferring to a new plumber base.
Shar stared at him. Why? You have just returned home, and now you are leaving again. Is it because Rayona is no longer speaking to you? I do not believe that is a reason to flee the planet. Rook Blanco shook his head.
No, Shar. My harmony is elsewhere, not on Ravana.
Shar blinked. The implication of this was staggering. Ravana did not have colonies like other planets. There were no Ravanaganders off-planet. If this was true, Rook Blanco's Amar was not of their species. Do you have hope you will find them? Shar asked, her voice small. She'd never had a lot of interest in the subject of Amars. She was much more interested in the minutiae of becoming a plumber, much to the chagrin of their father.
I will always have hope, sister.
She smiled and hugged him. Then you must go out into the stars and find your harmony, brother. He hugged her back and nodded.